All right. So, hello, my friends. Today we are going to be thinking about political communication. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. I'm going to share the PowerPoint that I have developed for our conversation today with you all in this moment. Um, Before I kind of launch too deeply into this PowerPoint that I've developed, I want to offer you some kind of extemporaneous remarks about political communication, okay? So, first of all, it is my premise that all communication is political. James, you might ask yourself, why is that the case? Why is all communication political? And I would say that it's the case because language itself is political, okay?
Yes,
Language
ma'am.
language itself is political. There is like an invisible politics that is embedded in our language itself, right? But when we talk about political communication in our in a global or national context, what we tend to be talking about is kind of the strategic communication that happens in the realm of politics. We're talking about political discourse as it is made manifest in our culture. And one of the ways in which political comm is made manifest in our culture is through public relations. So we see public relations efforts of political leaders in the materials that they release to the public itself, which there often are materials that they release to the public itself, and to the news media. We don't always see that, right? So that's often, in fact, made invisible to the general public, right? Um, we also see political communication as it manifests in advertising. Right now, even though we're living in a digital world, and I am a digital girl, to kind of steal and co-opt a line from Madonna. Um, we're living in a digital world, and we're seeing advertising, including viral advertising, come at us in different spaces, right? So maybe we see something on Facebook that's gone, or Twitter that's gone, or Insta that's gone viral. But it's really interesting to know, and NPR just did a piece on this a little earlier in the week, that our US presidential candidates in this moment, so Joe Biden and the incumbent Donald Trump, are still investing very heavily in traditional television advertising. And they're doing that, Brandon, because so many of us are at home amid the global pandemic, right? And so we're once again turning towards the big screen in our living room. Excuse me. In fact, I'm going to grab some water too. Okay. So give me a second. One last second here. Okay. We also see political communication manifest itself in news media, right? Sometimes it takes the form of satire. We've exposed ourselves in this class to a great deal of satire over the course of the semester, right? We've seen John Oliver. Maybe some of you watched Samantha Bee, or maybe you once upon a time watched, why am I blanking on his name right now? He preceded Trevor Noah on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart. Or maybe you watch Stephen Colbert, right? Like all of those individuals. Or maybe you watched the opening skit of SNL. That's political satire, right? So that's another way that political communication manifests itself in our media landscape. And it also, of course, manifests itself as political journalism and commentary and punditry in a variety of forms, whether it be kind of the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, or, the Atlantic, right? So I wanted you to have that kind of base understanding, right? A lot of really intriguing communication, political communication, happens at the intersection of, that was like I referenced Madonna a moment ago, and I almost vogued for you all, but it happens at the intersection of public relations, advertising, and journalism, and the entertainment ecosystems, right? So that's kind of what this survey that I'm about to offer you will help you to understand as well. Okay. So I'm giving you about 400 years of American history here in a relatively short period of time. All right. So we're really going to, over the course of that, really hone in on US presidential politics, this idea of the showbiz campaign, and the love-hate relationship with the news media that both presidential actors and the general population have. Okay. So first of all, it's really important as we dive in right here, and as a bit of an introduction to what you'll see in a couple of weeks when we talk about the First Amendment, to recognize that our founding fathers, yes, Thomas Jefferson, the friend of the man that you saw on the dollar bill, George Washington, that those founding fathers, okay, these were, well, I'll insert that bit in a moment, but these are founding fathers. We hear about them all the time in our history classes, in our history books, that they believed very much, very wholeheartedly in this idea of the First Amendment and in this idea of the freedom of the press. Okay, so this is from Thomas Jefferson himself. The basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. So in other words, Thomas Jefferson wanted to privilege the opinion of the people. James, Alexandra, that's you, right? You're the people. Thomas Jefferson wanted to privilege your opinions. The very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left for me to decide whether we should have government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter. So in other words, newspapers in the day of Thomas Jefferson, that was what a modern political journalist might call the medium of the moment, right? We talked about Marshall McLuhan last week. He said to us, the medium is the message. Well, the medium of the moment in that period of time was the newspaper. And the newspaper, that medium, served in a similar role as Insta or Twitter in that moment. In other words, it amplified the voices of the people. And so that's what Thomas Jefferson thought was of utmost importance. But here's the thing the point I was going to interject a couple of minutes ago. Thomas Jefferson, the gentleman who offered us this Enlightenment view that we should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? He didn't really mean that for all. He didn't really mean that for all. Instead, he meant that in a very narrow sense. Okay. He felt like all rich white men should have a voice. Okay. And that's really what he and other founding fathers were articulating. They didn't care about Black folks, right? They didn't care about women. They didn't care about the indigenous population. Not only did they not care, they didn't want those people to have voices, right? This was a very narrow sense of what it meant, right? This was a very narrow definition, right? But nonetheless, he wanted rich white men to have a voice in newspapers. That said, as much as this is what he was privileging and articulating at the moment that our nation was founded, this is a seminal moment, this is an important moment. He and other founding fathers, including John Adams, the first move that they made in a moment of crisis, in a moment of threatening international and domestic conflict, they moved to constrain our First Amendment rights. Okay. And they did that through the Alien and Sedition Acts, which took us back to a colonial notion that it was liable to say anything that the government might not want to hear. It's illegal for any person to write, print, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States or either House of Congress or the president with the intent to defame or to bring them into contempt or disrepute or to excite against them the hatred of the good people of the United States. Wow, right? So the first move that our founding fathers make when there is domestic conflict, when there is an impending war, is to constrain our First Amendment rights, to silence or censor things that they didn't want to hear. That really remains true even to this day, okay? And so ends kind of my preview around our conversation around media law and the First Amendment. A doc student by the name of Sheila Hawkins will be sharing more with us about media law and the First Amendment in a couple of weeks, but this is a bit of a preview for you as it relates to political communication. Really does give us a sense that all communication is political, right? Of course, during that moment in time, the context was we were in a partisan era of journalism. And what that actually meant in that moment was that we had party subsidized newspapers, okay? And in other words, party funded newspapers. That remains the case even until we get to the election, the deeply contested election of 1824. All of the men before you on this screen, even the one pixelating in the left corner, William Harris Crawford, had a newspaper in their corner in this presidential campaign. You see, through the colonial era and the period of the Revolutionary War and this early American Republic period, politicians had recognized the power of the press and the power of the press to speak to the people, right? And they all knew that they needed a newspaper in their corner if they were going to succeed on the national political scene. Ultimately, as we see here, JQA, John Quincy Adams, wins the presidency in 1824, but it is deeply contested. It's decided in the Electoral College. And I bring this up to show you two things. One, this idea that at this juncture in time, and even to this day, this remains true today, political candidates recognize the value of the news media in their quest to be the next president. And the second reason that I show you this particular slide on this particular day, less than a week out from the 2020 campaign, is that we very well might see this election being decided in the Electoral College. So in the next campaign cycle, Andrew Jackson won the presidency. Now, Andrew Jackson is from Tennessee, so many Tennesseans know him. That said, I won't offer you a deep biography of him right now. I will only say that as much as he is valorized in the curriculum that many of you were exposed to in the K through 12 educational system, it's really important to recognize that he was a vehement racist, that he was a champion of the Trail of Tears, right? Which killed hundreds and thousands of Native Americans, Cherokee, as those indigenous people who were here first were pushed westward, based in this logic of manifest destiny, which was the idea that God, that it was preordained, right? That God had given the WASPs, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men and women and children, this continent, right? But I also have this slide here before you today to emphasize kind of a greater point in my survey of approximately 400 years of American history. This idea that very early on, candidates and presidential actors recognized the value of antecedent public relations. So what Andrew Jackson was really known for is enlisting the help of newspaper publishers and then ultimately advisors like Amos Kendall in championing him as a common man, okay? So he was kind of one of the first president of the people, right? Now remember, this is a very limited notion of whom the people are, but he was known as a great champion of the common man. And the reason he was known for that was because of his expert antecedent public relations work. Now, we're gonna like move really far ahead. So this is 1828. And this is 1900 roughly. Okay. There's a lot that goes on in American history in those 75 years. We have a civil war that shakes this nation to its core. In that moment, President Abraham Lincoln, he is really still doing what Andrew Jackson is doing. He is relying on newspapers and newspaper publishers with whom he has culled a good rapport or a good relationship to broadcast his message to the American public. And the sense of the word broadcast that I'm using here is its original sense, which is the sense of agriculture. So broadcasting seed, okay, broadcasting seed. But Lincoln is relying very, very heavily on a newspaper publisher in Chicago, for instance, Joseph Medill, to spread the message initially during the campaign that he can lead our country through this perilous moment. And then he's relying on newspapers and newspaper publishers that are favorable to him to spread his messages throughout the course of the Civil War. So then we get to Teddy Roosevelt, also a racist white man, I might add, but that is a bit of an aside. Teddy Roosevelt gives us what we would call the public presidency. Okay. At least that's what scholars in political comm have called it, the public presidency. And he kind of borrows the idea from his predecessor, William McKinley. So William McKinley, like his predecessors, had recognized the value of the news media, of newspapers. In the period between Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley, newspapers working under the commercial model had become less partisan, particularly urban newspapers located in major metropolitan hubs. Okay. And so what McKinley did was he actually created space in the White House and made the presidency a news beat. Before that period of time, the presidency, which this is actually hard for us to imagine, but the presidency wasn't a freaking news beat. I mean, that's not to say reporters ignored the president and what he was saying completely, but they spent most of their time in the halls of Congress reporting the happenings there. And so it's really McKinley that first makes the presidency a news beat, and reporters are actively covering the doings of the president. And Teddy Roosevelt harnesses that completely. If we click here, and I will, I'm going to stop sharing here. Well, no, I'm not. If you click there, it's going to take you to a piece that was published in The Atlantic that really provides deep insight into how Teddy Roosevelt used public opinion, the press, leaks to Congress, and even muckraking journalists to further his own agenda. He called it the bully pulpit. And he was really trying to mold public opinion to his favor. Okay. So first to harness public opinion and then to mold it to his favor in order to enact legislation that he was interested in privileging. Now, so between this point in time and this point in time, there's space, right? In the corner right hand of your screen, you're going to see an image of Franklin Roosevelt, who is a distant cousin of Teddy. And what you see in the ensuing quarter of a century that separates Teddy from Franklin in office is you see that this idea of the White House press corps becomes institutionalized. So you have a group of news reporters who are actively covering the presidency as a news beat. And then you have US presidents who, kind of following in the footsteps of the presidents of the 19th century, are providing their spin to news reporters. They're doing that through ever more sophisticated professional public relations machinery. Okay? That's how they're providing their spin to news reporters that then circulate it to the American public. But here's the thing. News reporters aren't mindless dupes, okay? Even when individuals, savvy presidential actors like Franklin Roosevelt, calls the best rapport with reporters. And Franklin Roosevelt does just this. He develops some really solid relationships with reporters around him, okay? Even when presidents bend over backwards to do this, reporters aren't mindless dupes. And they don't always report the news in a favor that's preferable to the president. They often push back, in fact, right? And construct narratives that project images of a president that are adverse, right? And the reason that they do that, if you'll remember, is because technically, as a news reporter, your first obligation is to the truth, right? It's not to adhere to the wishes of someone that you may have culled a good relationship with, that you might be buddies with, right? Instead, your first obligation is to the truth. And so what happened is Franklin Roosevelt is operating during a really challenging time in American history, during the Great Depression of the 30s and during World War II. And though he's trying to spin the news in a way that is favorable and that privileges his agenda, which is really to enact progressive legislation that he thinks will help propel our country out of the Great Depression. Reporters are pushing back on it, right? And in fact, they are calling out Roosevelt for what they're articulating are socialist programs, right? So what does Franklin Roosevelt do? He uses the medium of the moment at his disposal, okay? And the medium of the moment that's at his disposal, it's the radio, right? And he is trying to, in the words of political scientist Samuel Colonel, go public, okay? No, I didn't say go to Publix, though you should stock up on some candy there. Thanks for this paid commercial. Oh, no, wait, Publix didn't pay me to say that. But no, Franklin Roosevelt is trying to go public. He's trying to convey his message to the American public directly and circumvent the press, which, by the way, he is critiquing as too conservative. And that wasn't kind of an unfounded critique. Newspaper publishers in that moment were over, and also still to this day, are overwhelmingly conservative newspaper publishers. Okay. And let me kind of casually, and when I say casually, I mean not so casually, look at my phone to see what time it is. I'm kind of speaking to you off the cuff this morning, and conveying to you about 4 centuries worth of information around political communications. And so what we're getting at, where we're at in this moment, what we've seen is that presidents have always seen the value of using the medium of the moment. In this instance, with Franklin Roosevelt, it was radio. About 25 years later, my math might be bad right there, maybe it's 35 years later, Jimmy Carter, he is using the medium of the moment, which is television, to speak directly to the American public, to circumvent the news media, the press, who, even though he, like his predecessors, has really tried to cultivate a good rapport with, to be chummy, to be friends with, they're not reporting the news in the way that he wants them to. And so he's going to speak directly to the American public as a way of promoting his legislative agenda. So what we've seen kind of as a way of reviewing in this moment before I go on, and before we kind of talk a little bit more deeply about showbiz politics and the negotiation of image, is this phenomenon. So like presidential actors, really starting with Washington, see the value of newspapers, the medium of the moment. So then it's radio, then it's television, to speak directly to the American public. As our systems, as we shift from a partisan news model to a commercial news model, and as those news reporters are pushing back more on what presidential actors are saying and not just blindly reporting their words, we have, kind of more sophisticated public relations operations happening inside of the White House. Okay, so those are the main points thus far. Then we get to this notion of showbiz politics. Okay. So it's really important to recognize in this moment that showbiz politics doesn't start with JFK. Okay. So John F. Kennedy, he arrives on the scene in the late 50s as a senator. But in the half century that preceded John F. Kennedy arriving on the scene, the one in which saw his father, Joseph Kennedy, having quite a bit of political power, in that half century, as public relations operations became institutionalized in the area of corporate America and also in politics, we also saw the emergence of the advertising industry on Madison Avenue and in other areas of the country. And as it kind of professionalized on Madison Avenue, it became ever more sophisticated. So suddenly, when, for instance, selling Coca-Cola, which I always have to push Coca-Cola as someone born in the state of Georgia, suddenly when selling Coca-Cola, we're not kind of producing a ton of ad copy that emphasizes that it's a common cure-all for every ailment, but instead we're pushing images. We're pushing images of a lifestyle that drinking a Coca-Cola is meant to enact. Okay. That's also, as much as we're selling Coca-Cola, we start selling politicians in a similar way. We're using in that moment, really starting even like with Calvin Coolidge. Certainly Herbert Hoover, though he clearly didn't do a very good job of selling himself amid the Depression. But he did do a good job of selling himself in order to get elected to the presidency. And he did so by using the apparatuses, the mechanisms of the advertising industry and the showbiz industry, right? Because we all know there's no business like show business, right? So P.T. Barnum had done this very effectively in the century prior. And suddenly, presidential actors, presidential aspirants, are recognizing the value of showbiz, right? And looking to sell themselves to the American people in order to end up at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House. And so what we see now is that by the time John F. Kennedy arrives on the scene, the national scene, in the late 50s, with presidential ambitions, his father says, we're going to sell John like soap flakes, okay? And in order to do that, he hires a photographer to literally cultivate the image of John as a glamorous Hollywood figure, right? So JFK is hanging out with the Rat Pack, and he's developing this image as someone who is as glamorous as a Hollywood stage actor, but who also is a loving father and partner to his wife, Jacqueline. We know, of course, that's not true at all, right? In fact, he's engaging in significant adultery. The news media at this particular juncture in time, they're not reporting on all of JFK's affairs, nor were they 30 years prior reporting on the affairs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because the idea at that juncture in time was, unless it's affecting this individual's ability to govern, we're not going to report on that detail. Okay. So in order to cultivate this image of John F. Kennedy, Jack, as someone who is glamorous as a Hollywood stage actor, yet a loving father and husband, a war hero, and someone who is capable, not capable, necessary to lead our country, Joseph Kennedy hires Jacques Lowe, who is a well-known photographer, to take images of his son. And what's the first thing that Jacques Lowe does? This is at an event before the political campaign has officially launched. This is what Hadley would call the invisible primaries. During the invisible primaries, this is an informal dinner in Omaha with a major campaign donor. Jacques Lowe, turns the camera back on the paparazzi, right? The hordes of reporters, photographers, and oh yes, the loving public behind them that are clearly adoring Kennedy. This image, this Omaha image, as it becomes known, is then kind of a part of the public relations machinery, the advertising machinery that follows Jack along the primaries as he battles the more establishment figure, Hubert Humphrey, in hopes of claiming the Democratic nomination in 1960. So John F. Kennedy, through his father, who, by the way, was one of the earliest actors, and not physical actors, but one of the earliest individuals involved in the Hollywood machinery early in the century. With that knowledge and understanding, John F. Kennedy really perfects showbiz politics. What we know is on the campaign trail that fall, he encounters the Republican nominee, the Vice President, Richard M. Nixon. Okay. On the campaign trail that fall, his campaign is running a series of kind of jingles, like you might hear, Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy can, right? Like I will post that video a little later, but that's an example of one of the jingles. They're also engaging in early negative ads. So this one's great. It's a clip of a press conference with reporters, and the reporters are asking Eisenhower, who's the president, Nixon is his vice president, can you tell me one thing that Nixon has done while you've been in office that's like extremely helpful? And Eisenhower says, like, give me a second. I'm botching it just a little bit. This isn't exactly as it was said, but it's pretty close. But like, he's like, give me a second, right? It's going to take a minute. And so that's one of the first negative political ads we see. This idea, and it's something that we've seen since in political satire. It's using an elected official's words against them, right? In addition to kind of seeing it in political satire, we, like, for instance, on The Daily Show, we also in the 50s were seeing it on the news, right? So at this particular moment, Edward Murrow is using the words of Joseph McCarthy, who is on a communist witch hunt against him, right? It's a very powerful technique. Excuse me, you all. And so now I'm being called. I apologize for that. And so Kennedy had really perfected this notion of showbiz politics, even in his engagement of what we would call, or what Daniel Boorstin did call, a pseudo event. And a pseudo event, in the words of Daniel Boorstin, is an event that is literally created to be reported on. It's not a real event, okay? And so the pseudo event that I'm about to tell you about is Kennedy's performance in what became known as the Great Debates, which was a series of 3 debates that fall of 1960 during the general election. And Kennedy and his advisors were masterful at winning that image war in that first debate against Nixon. So Nixon had spent quite a bit of time kind of studying and preparing for the debate, but he wasn't fresh for the debate. Instead, he came in with a 5 o'clock shadow, which he was kind of well known for. So he looked a little rough. And when in the studio, they asked if, like, he wanted, because guess what? For those of you who have ambitions of being kind of the next Barbara Walters, if you want to work in the studio, you're going to have to put on studio makeup. And so they offered Nixon this, and he was like, no, right? And he said no because he thought Kennedy had said no. But in fact, Kennedy had already, like, been well prepared. In addition to, like, wearing the studio makeup, like, Kennedy also, because of his Addison's disease, which he was hiding from all of the news reporters around him, he kind of always looked tan and glamorous, right? And he also looked pretty chill because for, like, the kind of treatment for the Addison's disease was like a pretty heavy regimen of drugs. So he looked real chill all the time. But Kennedy kind of wins this performance, so much so that, you know, if you heard it on the radio, which in areas like this, like in areas like East Tennessee, not everyone had a television in this moment, right? And so many of your, you know, grandparents were listening to it on the radio. If you heard it on the radio, you thought, like, polling results showed that you thought that Nixon won. But if you saw it on TV, and many people did, because the saturation rate of television was on the upswing, if you saw it on TV, then you felt confident that Kennedy won. Now, this ultimately is a very narrow election, and many people will articulate that it is Kennedy's performance in this debate that helps him over the finish line in one of the most narrow presidential elections in US history. Now, I would contend that that is a little bit media-centric of an explanation, that certainly this performance did help his cause, but it was his overall showbiz campaign that really emphasized Nixon as an establishment actor and emphasized him as an anti-establishment figure that could lead our country towards change, that hoisted him to the victory. So now Nixon, I'm going to take a closer look at my phone now. And it's Nixon that it's really important to keep in mind other presidents have had adversarial relationships with news reporters. In fact, I would make the argument that most US presidents have had moments of adversarial relationships with the news media, right? So this is when they get a little frustrated with kind of negative and adverse coverage, okay? So for instance, Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of '63, he was famous for kind of the rants that he would have towards the news media. In other words, sometimes he was damn mean. Old-fashioned hatefulness was shown towards news reporters who did not report things, news of the world around him, in the way that Johnson saw would be favorable. And there was a lot of that going on at that particular juncture in time because the news media was beginning to actively report on what is known as the credibility gap. And that was this idea that the lived experience on the ground in Vietnam was not the same as what Johnson and his general Westmoreland were saying. So even though, in particularly unsophisticated charts, Westmoreland was saying, like, we're winning this thing, right? The lived experience, the lived reality on the ground in Vietnam was that we were not winning that war. And in fact, it was a stalemate. This was a point that someone who was known at the time as the most trusted name in news, Walter Cronkite, the CBS anchor, reported to the American public in March of '68. Shortly thereafter, unbeknownst even to his closest advisors, Johnson asked for television time and ultimately told the American people that he would not seek nor would he accept the nomination for president. This ultimately creates a kind of a huge opening in the Democratic race for the nomination. This is in 1968, right? So we have a slew of individuals who are running for president, including JFK's brother, and also including Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, without contesting a single primary, is ultimately declared the nominee after the assassination of Robert Kennedy in June of '64. That's when Kennedy was assassinated, right after he wins the California primaries. You have a third-party candidate that is running. That is George Wallace. He is running in the American Independent Party. And then you have the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon, despite news reporters literally writing his political obituary after he loses that very narrow race to John Kennedy in 1960, and after he even fails to win the California governorship in 1964, reporters had written his political obituary, and he had kind of had a very contentious relationship with news reporters. And in a moment in which news reporters' credibility was beginning to come under attack. Many news reporters in '68 decided to give this new Nixon a chance. So even though Nixon on television to reporters was articulating this idea that he was not involved in showbiz politics, right? That they weren't selling him like a box of cornflakes or soap flakes or any other kind of flakes. He was actively engaged in a very deep and sophisticated showbiz campaign. And he was actively circumventing what his vice president would come to call the Eastern establishment press. He was circumventing the press, speaking directly to the American public in a way that really had perfected everything that FDR had ever intended. And then when he comes to power privately, he starts to attack the news media as he's calling them privately the enemy of the people, but publicly he's starting to engage in a campaign against the news media, not unlike the one that we see today in this moment, right? What is unlike it is just the unabashed way that Trump is able to refer to the news media, watchdog reporters, the Fourth Estate, as the enemy of the people. And the reason, I'm going to skip ahead to here, the reason that Donald Trump is able to unabashedly refer to the news media as the enemy of the American people is because of the ways in which the credibility of the news media was undermined in the decades following Nixon's presidency. And their credibility was undermined from within at points. So you had reporters like Tom Wicker who acknowledged, and this is true, I've said it in class before, that objectivity is a very flawed mode, right? But reporters like Tom Wicker were acknowledging that very vocally in the 70s. And then there were attacks, sustained attacks from the right that demolish the credibility of the news media. And guess what? We also did it to ourselves as well, because even under the auspices of credibility, we became partisan. Our news media system became highly partisan, right? With the advent of 24/7 cable news outlets and with the advent of kind of online media outlets that were highly partisan and kind of helped firmly establish our echo chambers that we now live in, right? We became highly partisan. And then we damaged our own credibility. And well, this is a bit of a preview in my last minute with you all today. We damaged our own credibility even at well-renowned institutions like the New York Times, right? What's known as the nation's paper of record. We damaged our own credibility with our reporting, right? So, for instance, there was the Jason Blair incident where he engaged in plagiarism that helped undermine the credibility of a legacy news media outlet like the New York Times, right? So that's kind of how we got here. What I kind of left out that I will share in like truly the last minute of class is that the public relations, advertising, and showbiz machineries, the image making apparatus of presidents, of former Hollywood actors, up through Barack Obama, only became more and more sophisticated. So, it was even more perfected showbiz politics since Kennedy. And that all of these individuals, including that man there who I spent a decade writing a book about, Jimmy Carter, they all engaged in a war on the press. So Jimmy Carter engaged in a war on the press. Ronald Reagan engaged in a war on the press. Barack Obama engaged in a war on the press. And it ultimately gave us this moment that we're living in today, in which the news media is actively constructed as the opposition party to Donald Trump. So I want to thank you today for your patience as I went over by about a minute or two in this class. But I it's hard to squeeze in 400 years of American history. But I felt like it was really important to get through this with you all. I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to stop recording. Wait a minute.